Hi, I'm Jean from Young Education. I teach English and I teach history, and it's one of my obsessions. So one of the things I wanted to point out to everybody is what's often ignored. What a text is about is dictated by the time at which it's written. The issues that are raised are those which are important when the text was created. So Shakespeare's texts, all of them, reflect the society in which he lived and which he saw every day. And for you, passing the exam means that you need to understand that as well as understanding the issues that apply today. Because despite the horror of many people, people didn't have the right to choose who they were going to marry, what they did, where they were going to live. Certainly not teenagers or women of any kind. We all were under the control of men, and that was one of the situations that Shakespeare is showing in Romeo and Juliet. Context means what's happening. It can be summarised by a list of words. When. Time is very important, because if you ask your parents their reaction to different situations, they're going to be different from yours. So when was the play written? Why was it written? It seems very obvious. It was written to entertain. But was it just written to entertain? Who went to the theatre in Shakespeare's time? Remember, there's no telephone, no television, no radio, nothing other than church or theatre. And very few theatres. Yes, you have them in the London area, but you don't have any in the City of London because they weren't respectable. They weren't posh. Despite the fact that everybody thinks Shakespeare is posh, it wasn't at the time. Shakespeare probably talked with a very broad Warwickshire accent. Maybe he lost a bit of it to be able to be understood in London, but he still had that different accent. Not an RP accent like mine. It was a countryman's accent. So, what is he saying? Why is he saying it? London in 1594, when he wrote Romeo and Juliet, was a very different place. A very violent place. Any gentleman would have a sword. Now, think about 3 foot long. That's the length of a sword. And they would walk round with them. People used a knife to eat with. Forks were relatively modern inventions. So everybody carried a knife. Think about it. Think about the attacks that would happen. And there were no policemen to defend you. Shakespeare's Globe was a very, very scruffy part of the South Bank. There were the pubs there, the inns, that sort of place. Loads of ships, lots of people coming in from abroad. So that is where they were. And Shakespeare tries to present to us, in Romeo and Juliet, some of the issues that were important. What does he show us? The importance of emotion. Think about it. Is Romeo and Juliet a play about love, or is it about hate? We'll explore this later, but these themes, these ideas, in this play are important. In any text you are studying are important, because they are the themes which are important at the time the text was written. Who? Shakespeare uses fairly ordinary people. The nurse, she probably had a country accent too, because she was a working class woman. But Juliet, she was an upper class girl. She would never have gone out of the house on her own. She would always have a servant with her. The only place she was allowed to go out of the house on her own was to go to church, which she does in the play. She wouldn't have gone to school. She probably had spent all her time in that house. Think too about her age. Her father says she's 2 months short of 14. You could be married at 12 because that was when you hit puberty. Wealthy girls were married usually between 12 and 14. So Capulet's comment that we'll wait until she's 16 is actually delaying marriage quite a long time. Working class women, they would marry probably in their 20s because they had to earn a living. Juliet didn't. But what we've got also is the quarrel between the Capulets and the Montagues. Probably the Capulets are new money because they haven't got the influential friends that the Montagues have. That's why old Capulet wants Juliet to marry Paris. He's related to the prince, and that gets them up a social step. So again, think about what's happening. Also, where is important. Because if you notice, you've got the play of Romeo and Juliet set in 2 places. It's set in the house of the Capulets, and it's set in the public square. The audience at the time, there were no backcloths, there was no stage props, and in fact the actors had to make their costumes and things like that, so they wouldn't have been terribly elaborate. So the audience has to have it all in words. You are told where you are. You are told what is happening. And you are then shown how things are, what is going on. Which brings us to the most important point of all, of context. How? How are we shown? Today, with films and pictures in books, we see what somebody imagines. If you went into, say, the globe, did you ever realise there isn't a roof in the centre of the globe? And I know from practical experience that if it rains when you're in the theatre, you get wet. So performances were only done during the summer. You wouldn't have them during the winter. The seats which were in the gallery, they were covered, but they weren't warm, and there was no lighting in those theatres because there were no light bulbs, there was no electricity. All lighting was candles or flames, torches. So you didn't have a performance in the evening. So you really had to use your imagination. Who went to the theatre? Yes, wealthy people, posh people. But the biggest audience were the ordinary, everyday people. They came and they stood in the middle. How do you know if you go to the theatre or the cinema when the performance is going to start? Yes, the lights go down, it gets dark. That didn't happen in the Elizabethan theatre. that was why in many plays you have a prologue. And we have that in Romeo and Juliet. It's intended to stop the people talking. It's intended to stop the barmaids carrying the beers around. Because don't forget, people didn't drink water. You drank beer because beer was safe. The water had been boiled. Ordinary water could give you an enormous amount of illnesses. So that was how they stopped it. And this is the start of Romeo and Juliet. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventure piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end naught could remove, is now the 2 hours' traffic of our stage, the which, if you with patient ear attend, what here shall miss, our toil shall strive to mend. I'll translate that. I made the point that I would translate the prologue. It's important that it is translated, not just because of the fact that a lot of the language is difficult for modern day speakers, but because you need to think about why Shakespeare puts it there. His audience is not, as I said, a posh audience. It's an everyday audience, and they are people who are looking at the society around them. So we begin 2 households. That doesn't mean today in a household we have probably mum, dad, children. In those days, a household would be mum, dad, yes, but quite possibly granny and grandpa, brothers, and if you were wealthy, it had virtually a little army, your manservants. Certainly the Montagues and the Capulets both had them, because there was no way, there was no police force, there was no way of enforcing the law, so you had to have men to defend it. So the emphasis is both alike in dignity. Dignity meant status in those days. Status implies money, it implies respect, it implies power. So we have 2 families, 2 households with a number of servants, roughly equal in status. Then we're told where it is, Verona. Italy was a very sophisticated country in those days. England, however much we might like to think, wasn't that sophisticated. So education, things like that, were really good in Italy. So that's where we're told, where we lay our scene, where our play is set. So education, wealth, interest. From ancient grudge. Look at that adjective, ancient. It implies something which has gone on for a very long time. A grudge, resentment, anger, quarrelling. break to new mutiny. So possibly there's been a peaceful period. It's now exploded again into actual, obvious warfare. Imagine it. You walk into the village or you walk into the town where you live, possibly the Saturday market, the stalls. Yes, you don't have any prams, so babies are being carried. Small children are walking. And in come what I'll call a gang. They wouldn't have called themselves a gang, but I think it gives you an idea of how they would behave. They look around. They're not concerned with all of you. You're ordinary. You're not special. And then out come the swords. Remember that length, 3 foot. Think how far that's going to reach. Think how dangerous that is going to be. Which brings us to the next line, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. Civil there means citizens. So translated, citizens' blood stains the hands of other citizens. So people are being killed by this quarrel. Think about the violence that is going on in this city. Think about the width of the roads. If you're in a classroom, maybe 2, 3 desks wide, maybe 10 foot wide. Remember, they only need a coach to go through. They don't need 2 cars to be able to pass. Narrow, dangerous. From forth the fatal loins of these 2 foes, from out of the bodies, from out of the families of these 2 enemies, these 2 groups of enemies. So we're now being told that Verona is at the mercy of 2 quarrelling families. A pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. Star-crossed is interesting there. Remember, at this time, they have no idea why illness happens. That's spells. The only way they have of being able to look at character and things like that is astrology. You probably all know your particular star sign. Okay, I'm a Libra. Balanced, calm, relaxed in life. But if I come up against an Aries, which is much more violent, I end up quarrelling. If I had the misfortune to be threatened with an Arian situation, I could end up dead, according to their thinking at the time. So star-crossed means that you're coming into really bad misfortune. So we have lovers, a young man, a young woman, one from each family, because from the families they take their life, whose misadventured, piteous overthrows, whose disasters, whose accidental things, doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The only thing that will stop those two families quarrelling is the death of the young people. The fearful passage of their death-marked love, the story of their falling in love, but it's death-marked. It's going to be a tragedy. This is what Shakespeare wants the audience to understand, that we're not going to watch a comedy, we're not going to watch a happy ever after. This is tragedy. It is death marked. And the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end naught could remove. The continual quarrelling and anger of those two groups of adults who should know better. We treat anger and quarrelling like that as childish, but look at these parents. The only thing that will stop them quarrelling is the death of their children. Can you imagine anything more serious? So Shakespeare is saying, come to your senses, adults. Think about this. Think what you're doing. Is now the 2 hours traffic of our stage. This is going to be the next 2 hours performance. It's a picture. It's telling that audience, it's quietening the audience down, making them listen, making them think. Yes, they've come to watch a love story. But what Shakespeare is pointing out is love, which Romeo himself calls a madness, doesn't always have a happy ever after amongst it. And marriage is not always the solution. It's really important when you're studying any text to be aware of social attitudes, social context at the time it was written, because that influences how we understand it. The number of people I've had say to me, well, why didn't Juliet just tell her mum and dad that she was going to marry Romeo? Or why didn't Romeo say what he was going to do? Basically, because at the time, children were the possession of their parents. Parents controlled precisely what children did. Particularly for women. There was very little education for women. Yes, the Queen, Elizabeth, she had been educated, but there were no girls' schools. And only about 25% of the male population could read and write. Yes, they could add up, because if you were in business, you had to be able to add up. You could possibly make your mark, an X or a squiggle that was recognised as yours, but they weren't literate. And that particularly applied to women. Women had no legal rights. The only time as a woman that you could control your own life was if you were a widow, an elderly widow with no male relatives. If, however, you married and your husband died, then your son controlled your life. Men always controlled women. What's interesting is that in Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare creates Romeo as impulsive, thoughtless, acting without thought, but Juliet is careful, very aware of the risks involved. So he is showing us something that is very different. He's not showing us a stereotype. Similarly, the nurse. She is a wet nurse. What's a wet nurse? Wealthy men liked their wives to keep their figure. So, wealthy women did not feed their own babies. There was no manufactured milk. You couldn't feed a baby from cow's milk and things like that. The only really safe way of feeding a baby, other than its own mother, was to employ a woman who had had a baby and was producing milk. That's a wet nurse. That is Juliet's nurse. She is an older woman. She's probably in her 30s, coming up to 40. How do we know? Because the average working class woman would marry when she was about 20. She would have a baby. A wet nurse was normally a working class woman. The aristocratic baby would take priority over her own. The nurse in Romeo and Juliet says, "Susan, she was too good for me. Her baby died for her to look after Juliet." So that was a common situation. She has quite a lot of status in the family. But she again has a lot of common sense. She looks out for Juliet. So Shakespeare shows us not just silly women, but women who are practical, sensible, and organised. So we have strong characters there. Not just the ditzy ones that you might expect. They're practical, they're aware, and they live well. The life of men is very different. I find it interesting that Romeo appears to have no career planned for him. His career is very much that of Tybalt and Mercutio. The family is obviously climbing up the social tree because Capulet and Montague, they've made their money. Quite possibly the Capulets are richer than the Montagues, but they don't have the social status. That's why old Capulet wants Juliet to marry Paris, because Paris is related to the prince, so they climb socially there. Social context again. Mercutio is Romeo's best friend. He too is related to the prince. So the Montagues have that status. They may not have the same money, but look also at the marital status of the two families. Old Montague and Lady Montague appear to be roughly the same age, in the same age group. Lord Capulet, however, I would guess that it's possibly his second marriage, because he says of Juliet that she is the only hope in his family. All the rest are in earth, which implies that his earlier children have died. The most common cause of death for women at that period was death in childbirth. We also know that Juliet's mother was her age when she bore Juliet. Therefore, Juliet's mother was about 13 and 8 months when she bore Juliet. Therefore, she must have become pregnant when she was 12. 12 was the legal age of marriage. But Lord Capulet is very obviously a much older man. So, if she's 12, he's probably about 50 now, late 40s, 50. So, second marriage? Interesting. That possibly explains why Juliet's mother is happy for her to marry at that young age. But it's not been a happy marriage. We know that from the way Lord Capulet speaks of his marriage and the way Lady Capulet speaks to him. Is that why Lord Capulet wants Juliet to marry later? Interesting to think about it, and it all comes out of the language. Men were expected to be tough, swordsmen. In short, what we are shown in the public space. However, the prince is there to stop it all. But if you notice, he is quite prepared to use force to stop it. So Romeo, Mercutio, Tybalt, all force. Capulets and Montagues, fighting, gang warfare, context.